The New York evening hummed with its usual restless energy, taxis honking, crowds surging through Midtown, neon signs blinking like tired eyes. Inside 30 Rockefeller Plaza, the controlled chaos of a live TV show was winding up for another taping. Backstage, crew members moved with the quiet urgency of people who'd done this 1,000 times before. Cables snaked across the floor, monitors flickered with camera feeds, and someone was double-checking the guest's water bottle for the third time. Keanu Reeves stood near the edge of the green room, not quite sitting, not quite pacing. He wore a dark sweater and jeans, simple, unassuming, the kind of outfit that wouldn't draw a second glance on the street. But here, in this world of bright lights and rehearsed laughter, his presence carried a different kind of weight. Not the weight of fame exactly, but something quieter, the kind that comes from years of carrying things no one else can see. He'd been doing this for decades, talk shows, red carpets, interviews where people asked him the same questions in slightly different ways. He never minded. He answered politely, often with a small smile or a thoughtful pause. But tonight felt different. Not because of the film he was promoting, though it was good, and he believed in it, but because of something that had happened just a few days earlier. While sorting through an old box in his garage, he'd found a letter. Not an email, not a text. Actual paper yellowed at the edges, addressed in handwriting he hadn't seen in over 30 years. It was from his father. The letter had never been opened. It had been tucked away, forgotten, maybe even hidden on purpose. He didn't read it right away. He sat with it on his kitchen table for 2 days, just looking at the envelope like it might vanish if he touched it. When he finally opened it, the words were simple. Not an apology, not an explanation, just a few lines about regret, about wishing things had gone differently. There was no return address, no phone number. Just a date, 1992, the year everything changed. Now standing backstage, he could still feel the paper in his hands. He hadn't planned to talk about it. He never talked about his father. But something about the way the question might come up tonight, the casual who shaped you, or who taught you to be so grounded, made his chest tighten. A stagehand appeared. 5 minutes, she said gently, as if sensing his mood. He nodded. Thanks. Out in the studio, the audience buzzed with anticipation. Phones were tucked away, drinks sipped quickly. When the opening music kicked in and Jimmy Fallon bounded onto the stage with his trademark grin, the room erupted in cheers. He bantered with the crowd, made a joke about New York traffic, then turned to the camera with practiced ease. And now, please welcome someone who needs no introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyway. The applause swelled as Keanu walked out. He waved, gave a small bow, and took the chair beside Jimmy. The two shook hands, warm, familiar. They'd met before years ago, and there was no pretense between them. Jimmy leaned in like they were old friends catching up over coffee. They started light, the new movie, riding motorcycles across the desert. That time he showed up to a fan's wedding unannounced. The audience laughed, relaxed. Keanu smiled, easy in his skin. For a while it felt like any other interview. Then Jimmy tilted his head, his tone softening just slightly. You know, people always say you're one of the most grounded people in Hollywood. Like genuinely kind. Where does that come from? Who taught you that? The question hung in the air longer than expected. Keanu looked down for a second, then back up. His eyes were calm, but there was something behind them. Like a door that had been closed for a long time was now just slightly ajar. My mom, he said after a beat. She was really strong, really loving. He paused. But there was someone else, too. The studio lights seemed to dim a fraction, though they hadn't. The audience leaned forward without realizing it. Jimmy stayed quiet, giving him space. He didn't jump in with a joke. He just listened. Keanu took a breath. My dad, he wasn't around much when I was growing up. We lost touch when I was pretty young. I didn't understand it then. Thought maybe I'd done something wrong. He spoke slowly, choosing each word like it mattered. It took me a long time to realize it wasn't about me. He was dealing with his own stuff, things he couldn't handle. He didn't say it angrily. There was no bitterness, just honesty. The kind of honesty that comes after years of silence. I used to wait by the phone, he added, almost to himself, even when I knew he wasn't going to call. A few people in the front row wiped their eyes. Someone sniffled quietly. Jimmy swallowed. He opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time in years on live TV, he looked unsure of what to say next. Not because he was unprepared, but because this wasn't a performance anymore. This was real. And then Keanu said something that stopped everything. He looked straight into the camera. Not at Jimmy, not at the audience, but into the lens like he was speaking to someone far away, maybe even to his younger self. Sometimes, he said, voice low but clear, the hardest thing isn't forgiving someone else. It's forgiving yourself for holding on so long. The words landed like a stone in still water. Ripples spread through the room. Jimmy's eyes widened slightly. He blinked, looked down at his notes, then back up. His usual quick wit was gone. In its place was something rarer, genuine human reaction. Without thinking, almost instinctively, he raised his hand toward the control booth. "Hold on," he said softly into his mic. Then louder, "Can we pause for a second?" The red live light above the camera blinked off. The audience froze. A producer near the wings froze too, hand halfway to his earpiece. The band stopped playing. The room fell into a silence so deep you could hear the hum of the lights overhead. Keanu didn't seem startled. He just sat there, hands resting on his knees, breathing steadily, like he'd finally said something he'd needed to say for decades, and now, whether the world was ready or not, it was out there. Jimmy turned to him, his voice barely above a whisper. "You okay?" Keanu nodded. "Yeah, I'm okay." But they both knew it wasn't just about being okay. It was about truth. And sometimes truth doesn't fit neatly into a 10-minute comedy segment. Backstage, someone muttered into a headset. A stage manager glanced nervously at the clock. But no one rushed them. No one cut in. For once, the machine of television slowed down. Not for drama, not for ratings, but because two people had stumbled into something real, and it deserved a moment of stillness. Outside, the city kept moving. But inside Studio 6B, time bent just a little, and in that pause, something shifted. Not just for the two men on stage, but for everyone watching, listening, feeling. No one knew it yet. But this moment would echo far beyond the studio walls. But that was for later. For now, there was just silence, and the quiet courage it takes to speak when you've been silent for too long. The silence stretched, thick and unfamiliar like the air before a storm breaks. In a place usually filled with laughter, music, and the rhythm of rehearsed banter, this quiet felt almost sacred. The audience sat perfectly still. No one whispered. No one reached for their phone. Even the crew, trained to move like shadows, paused in place as if afraid to disturb something fragile. Keanu didn't look away. He kept his hands resting on his knees, his breathing slow and steady. He wasn't performing. He wasn't giving an answer crafted by a publicist or polished for a soundbite. He'd simply spoken a truth that had lived inside him for years, maybe his whole life. And now it was out in the open, raw and unguarded. Jimmy turned fully toward him now, his usual showman's energy gone. His face softened, the way it might if a friend showed up at his door late at night with tears in their eyes. "You don't have to keep going," he said quietly, just loud enough for the mics to catch it. "We can come back to this." But Keanu shook his head slightly. "It's okay," he said. I think it's time." He looked out at the audience, not with the distant gaze of a celebrity addressing fans, but with the quiet focus of someone sharing a story with people who might understand. "My dad, he wasn't a bad man," he began again, voice low but clear. "He just didn't know how to stay, and I didn't know how to ask him to." He explained how, as a kid, he'd built his father up in his mind, imagining him as this larger-than-life figure who'd one day return with answers, with pride, with love. But the visits grew fewer, the calls stopped, and eventually the silence became the only thing left between them. By the time he was a teenager, he'd stopped expecting anything at all. "I used to think if I worked hard enough, if I became someone worth noticing, maybe he'd see me," Keanu said. "Maybe he'd be proud." He paused, and for the first time his voice cracked just a little. But he never saw any of it. Not the plays in school, not the first movie, not even when my sister got sick. He was just gone. A few people in the audience wiped their eyes. One woman covered her mouth with her hand. This wasn't the interview they'd expected. It wasn't funny or flashy, but it was real, so real it hurt. Jimmy didn't interrupt. He just listened, his expression open and kind. He'd interviewed hundreds of guests over the years, stars, politicians, athletes, but this felt different. This wasn't about promoting a project or sharing a funny anecdote. This was about healing. And sometimes healing starts with saying the thing you've been too afraid to say out loud. Keanu went on. Not in a rush, not for effect, but because the words needed to be spoken. He talked about the anger he carried for years, the kind that simmers under the surface, quiet but constant. How he'd bury it in work and travel and helping strangers. How he'd tell himself he was fine, that he didn't need that part of his past. But the truth was it never really left. Forgiveness. It's not about saying what happened was okay, he said, looking down at his hands. It's about letting go of the hope that it could have been different. And that's hard, because part of you always wants it to be different. Then he said something that made Jimmy inhale sharply. I found a letter from him last week, Keanu admitted, unopened, from 1992. I don't know why I never read it back then. Maybe I was scared of what it would say or what it wouldn't say. He didn't pull the letter out. He didn't need to. Just mentioning it seemed to bring the past into the room. I read it the night before I flew here, he continued. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an explanation. It was just sad. He wrote that he missed us, that he wished he'd known how to be better, and that he hoped someday I'd understand. His voice grew softer. I don't know if I do, but I'm trying. At that moment, something shifted in Jimmy. His eyes glistened. He looked down, took a breath, then looked back up. Not as a host, but as a man who'd also lost people, who'd also carried regrets. Without thinking, he reached over and put a hand on Keanu's arm. Just for a second. A small gesture, but it said everything. I hear you. You're not alone. Then, in a voice thick with emotion, he turned to the audience. You know, we come on this show to laugh, to have a good time, and that's important. But sometimes, life shows up in the middle of the script, and maybe that's okay. He glanced at the control booth. Let's take a real moment here, no music. No cutaways, just this. The producers hesitated. Live TV wasn't built for unplanned vulnerability, but they let it ride. The cameras stayed on. The audience stayed still. Keanu nodded, grateful. He wasn't looking for sympathy. He wasn't trying to make anyone cry. He just wanted to say it, out loud in front of witnesses so it couldn't live inside him alone anymore. I'm not sharing this because I want attention, he said gently. I'm sharing it because I know there are people watching who've been waiting by their own phones, who've built someone up in their heads just to protect themselves from the pain of them not showing up. And I want them to know, it's not your fault. His words landed like a lifeline. Back in the control room, a camera operator wiped his cheek with the back of his hand. In the front row, a young man stared straight ahead, jaw tight, blinking fast. Somewhere in the audience, a woman texted her brother a single message. I miss you. Let's talk. Jimmy finally spoke again, his voice steady but tender. Thank you for trusting us with that. Keanu gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Thank you for listening. The red live light stayed off a little longer than planned. No one cared about the schedule now. This wasn't just a segment anymore. It was a shared human moment. The kind that doesn't happen often on television, especially not during prime time. When they finally resumed, the tone had changed. The jokes were gentler. The laughter was softer. Even the way Jimmy asked the next question about the new film felt different. Like they were both aware that something important had just happened, and nothing would be quite the same after it. But the real impact wasn't in the studio. It was already spreading beyond those walls. In living rooms, in late-night dorm rooms, in hospital waiting areas, people were pausing their scrolling, sitting up a little straighter, feeling seen in a way they hadn't expected. Because the truth is, everyone carries something. A silence. A letter never opened. A call never made. And sometimes all it takes is one person speaking their truth to give others permission to face their own. As the interview continued, Keanu seemed lighter, not fixed. Not healed completely, but unburdened, just a little. Like he'd set down a weight he'd been carrying for so long. He'd forgotten how heavy it was. And in that studio, under the bright lights and the watchful eyes of millions, something rare happened. Two people chose honesty over entertainment. And in doing so, they reminded everyone watching that being human, really human, is the most powerful story of all. The red live light stayed off for nearly 2 full minutes, an eternity in television time. Backstage, a producer paced near the curtain, earpiece pressed tight, whispering urgent questions into his mic. but no one called for a cut. No one rushed to fill the silence with music or a commercial break. Something deeper was happening. And even the people who ran the show on tight schedules and strict run times seemed to understand. This wasn't the kind of moment you interrupt. When the broadcast finally resumed, the energy in the room had shifted. The usual rhythm of late-night TV, fast, flashy, funny, had softened into something slower, more thoughtful. Jimmy didn't jump back into jokes. Instead, he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and spoke like he was talking to a friend in a quiet kitchen at midnight. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, voice low, "but I'm glad you said it." Keanu nodded, his expression calm but tired, like someone who'd just climbed a steep hill. He didn't try to smooth it over or pivot to something lighter. He just let the moment breathe. And in that stillness, the audience stayed with him, not as fans, but as fellow travelers carrying their own unspoken stories. The rest of the interview unfolded gently. They talked about the new film, yes, but even that felt different. When Keanu described a scene where his character reconciles with a lost loved one, his words carried a quiet weight that hadn't been there before. Jimmy listened like every sentence mattered. The laughter that came later wasn't forced, it was warm, relieved, like people exhaling after holding their breath too long. When the taping ended, the applause wasn't the usual thunderous, on-cue kind. It was slower, deeper, grateful. People stood not because they were told to, but because they felt moved to. Keanu rose, bowed slightly, and shook Jimmy's hand again. This time, the handshake lasted a beat longer. No words were needed. Backstage, the usual post-show buzz was quieter than normal. Crew members exchanged glances, some with damp eyes. A makeup artist quietly handed Keanu a bottle of water and a clean towel. He thanked her softly, his voice rough from emotion. She just nodded, her own eyes shining. "That meant something," she whispered. He gave her a small, tired smile. "Yeah, it did." He walked to the green room alone, not because he wanted space, but because the world felt too loud all of a sudden. He sat by the window looking out at the New York skyline, the same view he'd seen 100 times before, but tonight it felt different. The city lights shimmered like distant stars, each one a life, a story, a silence waiting to be broken. His mind drifted back to the letter. He hadn't brought it with him, but he could still see the handwriting, the smudged ink, the way the paper had crumbled slightly at the fold. He'd read it 3 times since finding it. Each time he noticed something new, a hesitation in a sentence, a word crossed out, the faint scent of old tobacco clinging to the page. It wasn't a grand confession. It was just a man late in life, trying to reach across decades of distance with trembling hands. And now, by speaking about it on live television, Keanu had done something he never planned to do. He'd answered that letter, not with words on paper, but with truth spoken aloud. A knock came at the door. It was Jimmy, still in his suit, tie slightly loosened. "Mind if I join you?" Keanu shook his head. "Not at all." Jimmy sat across from him, not on the plush couch, but on a simple chair like he didn't want to seem too comfortable. "I've been doing this show for years," he said after a pause. "And I've had some incredible moments. But tonight, that felt different, real." Keanu looked at him. "It scared me a little." "Me too," Jimmy admitted. "I didn't know what to do when you said that. My instinct was to crack a joke, change the subject, keep things light. But then I realized that wouldn't have been right. You deserved more than that." They sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the city filling the space between them. "You know," Jimmy added, "my dad passed a few years ago. We were close, but there were things I never said. Things I wish I had." He looked down. "Hearing you talk about your dad, it hit me harder than I expected." Keanu didn't offer empty comfort. He just said, "It's never too late to say them, even if he's not here to hear it." Jimmy nodded slowly. "Yeah, maybe I'll write him a letter too." Later, as Keanu prepared to leave, a young intern approached him nervously, clutching a notebook. I just wanted to say thank you," she stammered. "My dad and I haven't spoken in 2 years. I've been too proud to call. But after hearing you, I think I will tonight." Keanu looked at her, really looked, and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Do it," he said gently. "Even if it's just to say you're thinking of him." "That's enough." She blinked back tears and nodded. "Thank you." Outside, the night air was cool. A car waited to take him back to his hotel, but he asked the driver to give him a minute. He stood on the sidewalk, breathing in the city's mix of exhaust, street food, and distant rain. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from his half-sister. Saw the interview. I'm proud of you. Can we talk tomorrow? He read it twice. Then he typed back, yes, I'd like that. Back at the studio, the crew was already breaking down the set. Chairs stacked, cables rolled, lights powered down. But the feeling lingered. A sense that something meaningful had happened here. Something that couldn't be measured in ratings or views. In the control room, the director replayed the moment Keanu spoke about the letter. He watched it 3 times, then quietly saved the clip to a private folder labeled Keep. Meanwhile, across the country, people were doing quiet things. A man dialed a number he hadn't called in 10 years. A woman dug out an old shoebox of letters from her mother and sat on her porch reading them under the moonlight. A teenager texted a simple message to a parent they'd been avoiding. Hey, how are you? None of it was dramatic. None of it made headlines. But it was real, and sometimes real is enough. Keanu got into the car. As it pulled away from the curb, he leaned his head against the window and closed his eyes. He wasn't thinking about the show or the film or even the letter anymore. He was just tired in a good way, the kind of tired that comes after you've finally told the truth. And for the first time in a long time, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt peaceful. When the episode finally aired 2 weeks later, no one knew what to expect. Promos had been vague, just a quiet clip of Keanu saying, sometimes the hardest thing isn't forgiving someone else. But that was enough. People talked. Online, in coffee shops, in group chats, the question kept coming up. What happened on that show? By the time the broadcast began, millions were watching. Not for comedy, not for celebrity gossip, but because something about that preview felt different. Like it was speaking directly to them. And when the moment came, the pause, the raw honesty, the unscripted silence, the internet didn't explode with memes or hot takes. Instead, something quieter spread. People posted screenshots of the quote about forgiveness. Others shared their own stories in long threads. About parents who left, siblings who drifted apart, friends who never got the chance to say goodbye. A therapist posted a gentle note. Grief doesn't need fixing. It needs witnessing. It got thousands of shares. One woman wrote about how she'd carried anger toward her father for 20 years, until she saw Keanu speak. That night, she dug out his old birthday cards, reread them, and finally let herself cry. Not out of bitterness, but release. Another man filmed a short video of himself calling his estranged brother for the first time in 8 years. The clip ended with the words, "We're meeting for coffee tomorrow." News outlets covered it, but not in the usual sensational way. Headlines read, "A rare moment of vulnerability." On live TV or when late night became a space for healing. Even critics who rarely praised talk shows called it a quiet revolution, in a format built for noise. Backstage at the studio, the team watched the response unfold with quiet awe. The intern who'd spoken to Keanu after the taping posted a photo of herself and her dad at a diner, captioned, "First meal together in 732 days." The makeup artist shared that she'd written a letter to her late mother that morning, something she'd put off for years. Jimmy noticed the shift too. In the days after the episode aired, his inbox filled with messages. Not complaints, not fan mail, but confessions. A teacher wrote that she'd used the clip in her classroom to start a conversation about emotional honesty. A veteran said it reminded him to call his son before it was too late. Jimmy read every one. He didn't respond to all of them, but he saved the emails in a folder labeled "Why We Do This." Meanwhile, Keanu stayed out of the spotlight. He didn't give follow-up interviews. He didn't post about it on social media. He just went about his days, walking his dog, stopping to talk to neighbors, visiting a local bookstore where no one asked for photos. But he wasn't untouched by what had happened. One afternoon, he received a package with no return address. Inside was a small wooden box, hand-carved with a note tucked beneath it. "My father taught me to make these. He's gone now, but I wanted you to have one. Thank you for giving me the courage to forgive him. And myself." Keanu held the box for a long time. It was simple, rough around the edges, imperfect, just like people. That same week, he met his half-sister for coffee. They hadn't seen each other in over a year, not out of anger, just life, distance, the slow drift that happens when no one makes the effort to stay close. But this time they talked, really talked. about their childhood, their regrets, the things they wished they'd said to their father while he was still alive. They laughed about old memories, cried about the ones that still hurt, and by the end made a promise. Let's not wait so long next time. He also finally mailed a letter of his own. Not to his father, there was no address for that, but to a younger version of himself. He wrote about the boy who waited by the phone, who thought love had to be earned, who carried shame like a second skin. He told that boy it wasn't his fault, that he was enough just as he was. He sealed the envelope, wrote, "To me, age 14" on the front, and tucked it into his journal. He didn't need to send it. He just needed to say it. At a small film festival in California a few weeks later, a young actor approached him after a screening. The kid was nervous, fidgeting with his hat, but he looked Keanu in the eye and said, "I've watched that Fallon clip like 10 times. My dad walked out when I was 12. I've been mad at him forever. But after hearing you, I think I'm ready to write him." Keanu didn't offer advice. He just nodded and said, "Letters don't fix everything, but they help you find your own peace." The young man thanked him and walked away, shoulders a little straighter. Back home, Keanu started quietly supporting a nonprofit that helps reconnect estranged family members. He didn't announce it. He didn't take photos. He just made calls, asked questions, and wrote checks. When someone asked why he chose that cause, he simply said, "Because silence costs too much." Online, the conversation kept growing, but not in the loud, chaotic way internet trends usually go. This was different, calmer, more human. People weren't arguing or performing. They were sharing, listening, healing, in their own small ways. A high school in Ohio even created a letter project inspired by the interview. Students wrote to people they'd lost touch with, not for grades, but for closure. One girl wrote to her grandmother in a nursing home. They hadn't spoken since her parents' divorce. The grandmother wrote back with shaky handwriting, "I never stopped loving you." None of this made the front page. None of it went viral in the traditional sense, but it mattered, deeply. And through it all, Keanu remained the same quiet presence he'd always been, just a little lighter, as if a door inside him had finally been left open, letting the air in. He still didn't have all the answers. He still missed his father. He still carried memories that ached. But now he carried them differently, not as wounds, but as part of his story. And that made all the difference. Because sometimes healing doesn't come from a grand gesture or a perfect resolution. Sometimes it starts with one honest sentence, spoken in a room full of strangers who turn out to be more like you than you ever imagined. Months passed. The city moved on as cities do. Seasons changed, headlines shifted, new shows aired, new scandals flared and faded. But something lingered from that night on the talk show, like a quiet hum beneath the noise of everyday life. It wasn't loud. It didn't trend forever, but it stayed with people, in the way a good song stays with you long after it ends, playing softly in the back of your mind when you need it most. Jimmy noticed it first in the little things. Guests started opening up more during interviews, not in dramatic ways, but with small truths. A musician talked about losing his brother to addiction. An actress shared how she'd struggled with loneliness despite being surrounded by people. Jimmy didn't steer them back to safe topics. He let them speak. And audiences responded, not with clicks or outrage, but with letters, messages, and quiet gratitude. Ratings didn't spike, but something deeper grew. Trust. Behind the scenes, the show's tone shifted. Writers began weaving in more human moments between the jokes. The band played softer during emotional segments. Even the lighting felt warmer, less flashy, more intimate. It wasn't a total overhaul, just a gentle course correction, like a ship adjusting its sails after catching a new wind. Keanu, meanwhile, returned to his usual rhythm, riding his motorcycle through quiet streets, stopping to help strangers, showing up to small events without fanfare. He never mentioned the interview again in public. He didn't need to. What he'd said had already done its work, but he wasn't unchanged. One rainy afternoon in Los Angeles, he found himself sitting on a bench in a nearly empty park. He wasn't waiting for anyone. He just needed air, space, a break from walls and screens. Across the path, a father knelt beside a wobbling bicycle, holding the back of the seat as his young child pedaled with fierce concentration. Every few seconds, the boy would glance back, eyes wide with fear and excitement, and the man would nod and say, "You've got this." Keanu watched them for a long time. There was no grand lesson in it, just a simple, ordinary moment of presence. But it filled something in him he hadn't known was empty. He thought about his own father, not with anger now, not even with sadness, but with a kind of quiet understanding. People are complicated. They carry wounds they don't know how to heal. Sometimes they pass those wounds on without meaning to. Forgiveness, he'd come to realize, wasn't about excusing the past. It was about refusing to let it steal your future. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a message from his half-sister. Dad's old watch arrived today. I had it fixed. Want to split the time? He smiled. They'd been talking regularly now about nothing and everything. Old memories, silly arguments they'd had as kids, dreams they still held on to. It wasn't perfect. There were still gaps, silences they couldn't fill, but they were trying. And that was enough. Later that week, he visited a community center that offered counseling for families rebuilding after years of distance. He didn't announce his visit. He just walked in, introduced himself as Keanu, and spent the afternoon listening. He heard stories of mothers and sons, brothers who hadn't spoken in decades, grandparents meeting grandchildren for the first time. No one asked for autographs. They just wanted to be heard. Before he left, a woman in her 60s approached him. She held a faded photo in her hands. My son and I haven't talked in 15 years, she said, voice trembling. I don't even know if he's alive. But after seeing you on TV, I wrote him a letter last week. I don't know if he'll get it, but I sent it anyway. Keanu looked at her, not as a celebrity, but as someone who understood. That's brave, he said. And it matters. Even if he never reads it, you chose love over silence. That changes you. She nodded, tears in her eyes, and squeezed his hand before walking away. Back home, he sat at his kitchen table with a cup of tea and the unopened letter from his father lying beside it. He hadn't hidden it away this time. He kept it out like a reminder that some things don't need answers to be honored. He also started writing more, letters to friends he'd lost touch with, notes to crew members on film sets, even short messages to fans who wrote him about their own struggles. He never promised fixes. He just said, I see you. Keep going. The world kept spinning. New movies came out. New interviews aired. But that one quiet moment on live television became something unexpected. A reference point. Teachers used it in classrooms. Therapists mentioned it in sessions. Parents showed it to their teenagers and said, it's okay to feel this stuff. Years later, at a small film festival in the Pacific Northwest, a young filmmaker handed Keanu a DVD of her debut short. It's about a daughter trying to understand her absent father, she said shyly. Your interview. It gave me the courage to tell my story. He watched it that night in his hotel room. The film was raw, imperfect, deeply human. At the end, the daughter doesn't get a reunion or a grand apology. She just sits alone on a porch reading an old postcard and whispers, I forgive you. Then she looks up at the sky and smiles, small, but real. Keanu turned off the TV and sat in the dark for a while. He didn't feel famous. He didn't feel like a hero. He just felt like a person who'd finally stopped running from his own truth. And in doing so, maybe helped a few others do the same. Now on this rainy afternoon in the park, the boy on the bike finally lets go of his father's hand. He pedals forward, wobbles, steadies himself, and keeps going. The father stands, clapping softly, pride glowing in his eyes. Keanu watches until they disappear down the path. Then he takes a slow breath, stands, and walks toward his motorcycle. The rain has lightened to a mist. The city hums around him, cars, distant laughter, the rustle of wet leaves. He doesn't have all the answers. He never will. But he's learned this. Healing isn't a destination. It's a choice you make again and again, to speak, to listen, to show up even when it's hard. And sometimes that's enough.